Thanks to Shopify for supporting Future Hindsight. Shopify is a platform designed for anyone to sell anywhere, giving entrepreneurs like myself the resources once reserved for big business. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. And if you want to support Future Hindsight, you can. Join the Civics Club on Patreon for early access to episodes every week. Head to patreon.com/futurehindsight to sign up. Welcome to Future Hindsight, a podcast on a mission to spark civic action. I'm your host, Mila Atmos. I'm a global citizen based in New York City, and I'm deeply curious about the way our society works. So each week, I bring you conversations to cut through the confusion around today's most important civic issues and share clear, actionable ways for us to build a brighter future together. After all, democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. Here on the show, we have heard many times, join a union. That's relatively straightforward if there is a union at the workplace. But since only 6% of the private sector is unionized, chances are there is not a union at your place of work. So your best bet might be to form a union. But how would you do it? Where do you start? We know that the road to unionization has never been easy. Throughout American history, workers who organized have faced intimidation, violence, and systematic opposition. And yet, despite these obstacles, unions transformed American labor and society, giving us weekends, the 8-hour workday, workplace safety regulations, and a middle class that once seemed unshakable. Today, we're witnessing a revival of labor organizing, from Starbucks baristas to Amazon warehouse workers, digital media staff to graduate students. A new generation is rediscovering collective power in unexpected places. What does it take to build power from scratch? And how might these efforts reshape our workplaces and democracy? To unpack these questions, we're joined by Jaz Brisack. They are a union organizer and co-founder of the Inside Organizer School, as well as the author of Get on the Job and Organize, Standing Up for a Better Workplace and a Better World. Jaz's journey from Rhodes Scholar to Starbucks barista and organizer offers a unique perspective on how building worker power happens in practice and what it might mean for our collective future. Welcome, Jaz. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I really, really enjoyed your book. Congratulations. It's a how-to, a memoir, and a history of organizing. Really, really comprehensive. And I thought to ground this conversation that we should begin with the philosophical underpinnings of unions. You argue that unions should be the norm at every workplace. Tell us why.
Well, I think that democracy should be the norm in every workplace. And I think that unions at their most fundamental level exist as an independent organization where workers have true power to advocate for their own needs in their workplace. Without a union, management has the final say on everything, and they could be benevolent, they could be not so benevolent, but they're still, at best, a benevolent dictatorship. And I don't mean that in a rhetorical sense. I mean, without a union, workers have no input into the way that the business is run, into their own conditions of work and of life. And so I think having that say and that democracy is really fundamentally important, whether you're in a good workplace or a bad workplace, because people should have more involvement in the very fundamental ways that they're living their lives.
Yeah, give us a little bit of a concrete example, just because, most people think about unions as just being limited to bargaining for better wages and, let's say, better hours or healthcare. But you're saying something different, I think.
Obviously, people's wages and benefits and working conditions do impact their lives in a really fundamental way. And work is often the place where people are spending most of their lives. And so having a say in the place where you're spending so much of your life is critically important. But I think unions also give people the ability to take action around other issues, to speak out about things that are fundamentally important, and to have protection from retaliation when they're doing that. And so whether it's Starbucks workers advocating for protections from retaliation for being trans and from the company rolling back gender-affirming healthcare, whether it's unions taking stances on issues from Palestine to racial justice to Black Lives Matter. I think there's many, many applications that people can use democracy in the workplace to advocate for. But I also think you shouldn't let the boss make the decisions without input and unilaterally on things that are affecting people every single day.
Well, I mentioned in the intro that unionization is not easy. And in fact, the U.S. has a really long history of really brutal union busting, meaning people get killed. But nowadays, that doesn't really happen. Or even if it does, I think it's quite rare. So what are the usual anti-union talking points that dissuade you from forming or joining a union? And I would say that most anti-union arguments are basically pro-capitalism arguments. So what's the most common argument that you hear against unions?
I mean, I think the most common reason why people don't organize a union is fear of retaliation. So maybe it doesn't look like the National Guard coming in and massacring you and your family like it looked like in the 1910s in the U.S. and like it still looks like for union organizers in many other countries. But I think workers are still terrified of how is the boss going to react to us organizing? Am I going to lose my job? Am I going to lose my benefits? And I think union busting now sort of looks like a carrot and the stick situation where you have, please give us another chance. We'll be really nice. We're listening to you. Here's these benefits that, we know that these new benefits would change your life. And so we'd like to listen to your concerns and make these improvements. But also, if you unionize, you could lose everything. You could lose your ability to transfer. Everything will be frozen. So we can't give you these new things. And increasingly, companies are using the carrot as a stick, meaning they are promising things with one hand and then threatening that if you unionize, you won't get those things and you will become worse off.
Yeah, it's a little bit like they're very nice to you so you don't unionize. But then if you do even think about unionizing, then they turn into these really cruel bosses, which is kind of a schizophrenic way of being at the workplace. Well, now that we've kind of covered the philosophical underpinnings, let's talk about your experience unionizing at Starbucks. You were salting, which is to say that you worked there purposely to attempt to unionize the place. I mean, of course, when you applied, you didn't say that. But you spent a lot of time building credibility as a true partner, as they call the Starbucks employees, before you started talking to people about organizing and persuading them to join the effort. And obviously, before you can get a proper campaign off the ground, you will need enough people who will want to join your efforts. So when you are talking with someone who's on the fence or even agnostic, let's say neutral, how do you persuade them?
I think the most important thing is understanding what motivates people, what motivates your coworkers. There's a very common rule, which is the 70-30 rule, which means that you should be listening about 70% of the time and talking about 30% of the time. And so the most important way to persuade someone is to understand what their issues are. Most people, even people who love their jobs, don't think their jobs are perfect and don't think that everything is being run the way it should be, because most people do want a voice. Most people who are making decisions in corporate structures, especially ones as big and stratified as Starbucks, where you have billionaire CEOs and then baristas who are living paycheck to paycheck, most of the people making decisions about how the business is going to be run are not the ones actually working those jobs, who understand what it takes to make the company run every day and who are building the relationships with the customers that the company relies on. And that having more of a say would enable them to make the changes that would make their own lives better and also make the company work better. But I think it's not prescriptive. So you have to listen to what other people in the workplace are advocating for and help them understand that they could actually take action collectively to make their own vision for the company a reality. And so expressing to people, like, here's what the process would look like, and we will fundamentally be winning the right to sit down with the company on an equal footing to negotiate about what we want to see change. And I think your voice is critically important in serving on that bargaining committee and helping make this company what we all want it to be is a really effective message because you want to help people understand their own agency in shaping that future.
Right. Well, I think this is the thing that people often forget, right? Unionization is just about being able to get to this bargaining table. And then you still have to do the bargaining.
Right.
you
right.
know? Tell us a little bit about your experience bargaining after you were successful in unionizing.
Well, bargaining depends so much on the company and their outlook. And so the most fundamental thing in unionizing is winning the right to organize, which means the company recognizes that the workplace power dynamics are changing and becoming more democratic. You might win an election. You might have unanimous support in an election, as we did at Starbucks many times. But the company will still try to prevent you from winning anything at the bargaining table so that it doesn't continue to expand the union effort throughout the company. So it was an extremely different experience bargaining at Starbucks, where they were taking our bargaining proposals that we were presenting across the table and then using those proposals to try to bust the union elsewhere by saying, hey, you're asking for seniority pay, or hey, you're asking for these improvements. We're only going to give these to non-union stores, and if you unionize, then you won't be able to get them. And they were spreading all kinds of other misinformation to try to prevent people from organizing. Versus bargaining a contract at a company like Ben & Jerry's, which recognized that busting a union was not compatible with their public image, proactively agreed to the right to organize and signed what's called the Fair Election Principles, which are a code of corporate conduct that we'd also asked Starbucks to sign that basically promised that they would be neutral, they wouldn't retaliate. If they had an anti-union meeting, we'd have equal time to have a pro-union meeting. Ben & Jerry's voluntarily recognized the union. And so bargaining with them was still a back and forth. It still took us about 7 months to reach a contract. But they were willing to actually listen to workers and discuss our proposals instead of figuring out what their next move was to try to bust the union.
Mm-hmm. So what's the current status at Starbucks? Has the bargaining ended?
So the Starbucks contract bargaining story is a long one. It's been 3.5 years since we won our first union elections in Buffalo, New York. The company spent about the next 2.5 years running a scorched earth union busting campaign, from firing workers to closing stores to retaliating against workers through hours cuts and all kinds of other retaliatory policies. We'd always thought that the pressure point on Starbucks would be, customer support, a boycott, that their brand image was important to the company, and that targeting their brand by telling people, don't go to Starbucks because they're violating workers' rights was the way that we would bring them to the bargaining table. It took a long time to get there for a variety of reasons. But then in 2023, the Starbucks Workers United Union took a very strong stance in solidarity with Palestine. Management at Starbucks freaked out because Howard Schultz is, famously a Zionist, famously extremely opposed to solidarity with Palestine. So he started suing the union for this support, retaliating against unionized stores, gave a list of every unionized store, including some that were not actually unionized. And so people were getting death threats called in and all kinds of retaliation. This action sparked a global boycott of Starbucks. And so Starbucks finally was like, hey, we want to come back to the bargaining table. But it's not as clean cut as they came back to the bargaining table and everything has been happily ever after, because they've continued to appeal some of the court cases, including appealing to the Supreme Court, which struck down some worker protections for all workers.
What are those?
So basically, Starbucks had been ordered to reinstate the 7 workers in Memphis, Tennessee that they had illegally fired in retaliation for union organizing. And they took the case all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that it should be harder for unions to get emergency relief when workers are fired and get those workers back to work sooner. So it just makes it more onerous and more unlikely that workers who are fired in retaliation for organizing will get reinstated quickly. For context, I was fired by Starbucks. I'm still waiting 2.5 years later for, any updates. In my case, it can take years and years for fired workers to get their jobs back.
Yeah, I think this is the other complication, right? That the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, is essentially toothless. I mean, it can rule on things and say you need to do this, but then there's no real enforcement mechanism. And then
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's really complicated. And then you can't get back pay even if you do get reinstated. It's all very hard.
You can get back pay, but companies obviously will try to drag the process out as long as possible.
Yeah.
And under U.S. labor law, there's only remedies. There's no penalties. So they might have to make you whole. But to Starbucks, it's way more cost effective to fire people and have the fear and terror that strikes into workers to try to prevent more workers from organizing than to eventually have to pay some back pay or reinstate someone, 5 years later.
Right.
So
also, that's pennies for them at the end of the day.
Exactly.
So what is it that the Starbucks workers want? What are they bargaining for right now?
I think from the very beginning of the Starbucks campaign, our primary demand has been to actually have a voice and a democratic process in the workplace. And the issues that we're raising in negotiations have been as varied as protection from abusive customer interactions where, everybody has a story about sexual harassment or transphobia or targeted abuse that workers are just expected to take. The customer is always right kind of thing. Everything ranging from that to protections like just cause, which means you can't be fired or disciplined unfairly, to the dress code. Starbucks just got new headlines around trying to go back to a very old-fashioned version of their dress code. We had many debates and bargaining over things like that, where Starbucks was trying to insist that the dress code was the cornerstone of their brand. And we were like, we think it might be more damaging to your brand to be union busting and getting all of this bad publicity for those actions versus like us wanting to wear a purple shirt. But okay. And then, workers have been trying to fight for expanded healthcare, including restoring the gender-affirming health benefits that a lot of people went to Starbucks for, and that Starbucks rolled back, partly in retaliation for organizing efforts. But our proposals have also included really broad and democracy-minded proposals, like trying to fill the empty seat on the Starbucks board of directors. Because
tell us more about that. Because when I read that, I was like, what is this empty seat? It doesn't make any sense to me. But what is the idea that they talk about, and what is the idea that you have in mind?
Right. So the CEO, Howard Schultz, has given many speeches and, talked at length about this empty chair. And supposedly at every board of directors meeting, they have an empty chair at the table that symbolizes Starbucks partners. And he's even given speeches where he's like, this is not a metaphor. Like, we're so sincere about this empty chair. Like, this symbolizes our commitment to you, the workers. And so our proposal was, hey, you call us partners, you have this empty chair, why don't you put a partner in the chair? And so we had many debates over this in union negotiations. A way to tell if a company is sincere about negotiating a contract with you or not is who they're sending to the bargaining table, right? So if they're sending people from the company who are making decisions, that's a good sign. If they're sending their union-busting law firm, that's a bad sign. Starbucks sent their Littler Mendelsohn union-busting lawyers to the bargaining table, and these union-busting lawyers engaged in very lengthy debates about the existence of this chair. They were insisting that the chair was a metaphor, that we needed to go back to high school English if we didn't understand metaphors because this chair didn't exist, which of course was not what Starbucks' longstanding talking points about this chair were. While it might sound kind of like a silly thing, I think it really speaks to the way that Starbucks claims to care about workers as this theoretical empty entity, but actually doesn't want to engage with workers when you might actually have a voice and say in the company.
Well, I think it was definitely curious. I mean, I'd never really thought about it until I read your book that, Starbucks likes to say it's this progressive place to work. It's a progressive company, and it used to offer gender-affirming care, and it's based on the West Coast, et cetera, et cetera. And it was the kind of thing where I think when Starbucks first started becoming big, people wanted to buy Starbucks coffee because of this image. But it's so long ago that I had not really remembered until I read your book that I was like, oh, yes, that's Starbucks, because now it's just this corporate behemoth that you primarily, or that I primarily encounter at the corners of city blocks or at the airport. And I think one of the reasons that boycotts have maybe not been as effective as one would like, let's say if you wanted to be a supporter of unionization, is that Starbucks is convenient.
I think the boycott around Palestine has actually been incredibly effective and cost Starbucks a ton of business. I mean, I write about...
Even in the United States?
Yes. I mean, it's become, we always said it needed to be socially unacceptable to be a union buster. And I think the combined boycott, divestment, and sanctions boycotting plus the union busting has made it uncool to be seen with, your Starbucks cup. Maybe not in every circle, but certainly a lot of young people, a lot of progressives, a lot of Starbucks target demographics see it as very uncool, especially as the companies continued to take down pride decorations and, undo a lot of their famous progressive stances on a range of issues. I write about the issues we had with trying to call a boycott where those of us on the ground from the beginning thought that the way that we would win was with a boycott, just like we'd run at Spot Coffee, a local coffee shop chain that had changed Spot Coffee's behavior from union busting to recognizing workers' right to organize. The top leadership of the union was never that interested in a boycott. And so you had sort of spontaneous grassroots efforts toward boycotting Starbucks, but then people would be like, well, if the union isn't calling for a boycott, then should we really be boycotting? I think part of the effectiveness question was that there wasn't a coherent message and the union needed to call for a boycott. But I do think once the Palestine boycott began, that made it a uniting issue instead of this kind of nebulous, are they calling for one, are they not calling for one situation?
Interesting. Well, I definitely think that boycotts work. I mean, stopping yourself from spending money someplace is definitely a good place to make the company listen to you. We'll be back with Jaz in just a moment, so stay with us. You can't miss this episode, Civic Spark. One small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, Future Hindsight has been coming to your ears for almost 8 years, and it's safe to say we've found our groove. But in the early days, it wasn't so easy. It felt like I had to figure it all out on my own. Whether that was finding guests, recording the episodes, editing everything, you name it. When every day seems to introduce another question that needs an answer, it can be an overwhelming feeling. Anytime you're starting something new, it's like your to-do list just grows and grows with new tasks every day, and that list can pretty easily take over your life. So, how do you find the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything? Because that can be such a game changer. For millions of businesses out there, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States. From household names like Death Wish Coffee and Momofuku to brands that are just getting started. So if you want to get started, take the first step with your own design studio. With hundreds of ready-to-use templates, Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store to match your brand's style. And if you want to accelerate your content creation, Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. With all these great tools at your fingertips, you can get the word out as if you have an entire marketing team behind you. In just a few quick minutes, you can easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. It's so great to know that Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. You know what I love about Shopify is that no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. Turn your big business idea into cha-ching with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period and start selling today at shopify.com/hopeful. Go to shopify.com/hopeful. Shopify.com/hopeful. We also want to share about a podcast called Assembly Required. It's hard not to want to tune out the news these days, but despite how overwhelming things feel, we are not powerless. Our job now is to pool what we've got and see what we can make happen. At Assembly Required, Stacey Abrams will face each executive order, legislative policy, and every news cycle, no matter how terrifying or absurd, by asking, what can we do to learn more about what's happening? What can we do to solve problems, however small? And how can we find the kind of hope that can sustain our work in difficult times? Tune into new episodes of Assembly Required every Thursday, wherever you get your podcasts, or on YouTube. And now, let's return to my conversation with Jaz Brisack. You mentioned the Supreme Court essentially ruling in favor of Starbucks. And we also talked a little bit about labor laws really not being very strong in the United States. So is there legislation that is being proposed or that we should propose to make unions more easily accessible for those who want to start a union at the workplace?
I mean, there's been lots of great legislation. There's lots of changes that I would also encourage, everything from the fact that managers who blow the whistle on union busting do not have the same protections as other workers because managers aren't protected under the National Labor Relations Act. There's been bills like the PRO Act, have gotten a lot of support, but haven't been able to pass, partly because of people like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, partly because, obviously it's a very party line issue because Republicans want to side with their big business backers. But I think fundamentally we're not going to get labor law reform until we have a stronger labor movement. And you could say, without labor law reform, we're not going to be able to get first contracts. We're not going to be able to make as much headway against these companies like Starbucks and Amazon that are doing anything within their power to bust the union. But I think one of the really fundamental things that union organizing is doing is helping change public narratives around organizing. And union density has continued to fall even over the last couple of years. We're at 5.9% now. We're under 6% for the first time in, maybe 100 years. Certainly since, it became more feasible to organize after the passage of the NLRA in 1935. So I think having these organizing campaigns and making the issues around union busting like a household topic of conversation is one of the only ways that will kind of build the public momentum needed to pressure the law, pressure the policymakers to change the laws to facilitate more organizing. And so even if we have campaigns that aren't necessarily, winning right now, I think that making this a much more widely understood topic is really critical. And having campaigns that are, going viral on TikTok or capturing the public imagination and also showing a new generation what unionizing means and that contrary to what your boss thinks, it's not just for coal miners and manufacturing workers. It's really critical. And as our economy becomes more, service-oriented, service workers deserve unions too. So I think that narrative is really fundamental, and that's the only way we're actually going to get the law to change.
Right. So win or lose, unionization efforts are valuable if, at the very least, to change the narrative around workers' rights, democracy at the workplace, and unionization writ large. So tell us about Inside Organizer School. What would someone learn there? How do you attend? And how did you think about it in the beginning?
I was lucky enough to be one of the folks that helped start the Inside Organizer School back in 2018. My organizing mentor, Richard Bensinger, was pulling together a collective of organizers with the goal of teaching workers how to organize their own workplaces and helping connect young people and activists looking to get involved with the labor movement with pathways to actually making a difference by getting a job and helping organize your coworkers, aka salting. So I was involved with helping teach some of the early parts of the school, helping recruit participants to come to the school. But I hadn't gotten the chance to actually salt myself. So the Inside Organizer School curriculum became the way that I learned, what salting was, what effective workplace organizing from the inside was. And those were the lessons that I took into my store when I got a job at Starbucks and started trying to organize. And when we recruited more folks to join the campaign, they also, went through the Inside Organizer School training and took those same lessons into the workplace. So Starbucks Workers United is definitely the highest profile campaign that's come out of the Inside Organizer School so far. Hopefully there'll be many more soon. But we've been involved with campaigns ranging from, Canada Goose seamstresses to Lush cosmetics workers. We've had all kinds of folks from Chipotle to Trader Joe's to Amazon come through the school. And I think our goal is to help elevate the conversation around salting and make organizing your own workplace more accessible, give people the skills that they need to do that, and also help people understand, don't just go try to get a union staff job. The best way to learn how to organize and the most effective way to help non-union workers get a union is to organize your own workplace and get a job and help start that process. Very important. We also try to teach people, you're not going to be like the vanguard of the revolution coming in to save the day. You're the spark that can help identify the leaders and workplace folks who are already there who can carry that forward. So like at my store, I wasn't the leader. I was the person who could have an organizing conversation with Michelle Eisen, who'd been there for 11 years. And then she would become the leader of our effort. So you shouldn't have a savior complex about this, but it's by far the most effective way to help people understand, hey, this is actually possible.
Well, tell us a little bit about the difference between working as a staffer, because you did a little bit of that also in terms of helping with the Nissan plant unionization effort that failed. So you were on the outside helping the people on the inside organizing. And then your experience of being at Starbucks and the SEIU swooping in later on in the day, essentially usurping your grassroots organizing efforts. So, what's the difference between the two in terms of practically if you are, let's say, trying to decide what you should do with your life, whether you should organize from the inside or whether you should work for a union outfit? And, when I was reading your book, it occurred to me when you told the story about what happened with the SEIU that maybe one of the talking points of the Starbucks corporate people that a third party, meaning the union, would come in and bargain for you instead of with you was not necessarily far off.
I was in a really weird position as a SALT because almost every SALT is volunteer and is, not working with the union. I was actually working as the organizing director for our region of the union while I was salting because I thought it was the most effective way to help start the campaign, and I wanted to get that experience, and I started at the height of the pandemic. So my experience salting was different than what most people's would be, but as a SALT, you get to experience the camaraderie of the workplace. You get to build really genuine connections with people on a level that you can't really access if you're, knocking on somebody's door and, having a organizing conversation through a house call. But I've loved every kind of organizing I've been involved with. I mean, Nissan, especially because it was my first campaign, taught me everything that I knew and was the basis for a lot of my experience going into Starbucks. And I learned a lot about how to talk to workers who weren't already on board with unionizing, who had a lot of reservations about what they thought, the left-wing implications of unionizing might be. For folks who are thinking about what to do, I would recommend salting as an experience that every organizer should have, or organizing your own workplace that you're already in, because you understand the process in a much deeper way. It's different to, listen to a tape and debrief a captive audience meeting where management's trying to convince workers not to unionize if you're on the outside versus actually sitting in that meeting and, hearing your boss or your boss's boss's boss tell you these things. But I don't think it's a value judgment. I think oftentimes people who SALT do end up taking on staff jobs, and it's really valuable for staff to understand what workers are going through. To the point about the union as an outside third party, having more folks in the labor movement, both, non-union workers who are becoming members and making demands on what their union should be and how their union should behave, through organizing the unorganized and demanding that unions give workers that kind of autonomy and that kind of grassroots ability with the backing needed to help bring the hammer down and win that right to organize is extremely critical. And I think Starbucks Workers United is a bit of a case study, both in the best ways to run a worker-to-worker organizing campaign and also what unions need to avoid doing to stop potentially stifling a lot of that momentum.
Mm-hmm. So if you could redo this Starbucks campaign, what would you do differently?
I think I would try to make sure that the structures that we were putting into place earlier on ensured that we had more democratic decision-making from the get-go, because often you don't really want to elect stewards or elect union presidents for your local and those kinds of things until you have a contract, because you need to be able to move quickly to, respond to changing elements of the campaign. But that said, I think the fact that we didn't have a true partner structure in place meant that the campaign was more malleable. And as the parent union came in more, they were able to install more and more of their top leadership into those positions instead of actually keeping workers in those roles, which was what we had tried to do from the beginning. So making sure that everyone is on board with local autonomy is really critical. I mean, the same thing kind of came up with the Tesla campaign. We had promised Tesla workers that they would have the local autonomy that they wanted to make their union in their image, to make the decisions about what they would be bargaining for, how they would be running the committee. And we were able to back that up on the local level. But then as the parent union and the other union that was claiming jurisdiction came in, we didn't have the ability to back up those promises. And so I think making sure that more of that is established before we actually tell workers, if you organize, you will have this power.
Right. I have a question from 30,000 feet. We are in a really reactionary timeline in human history overall, but most definitely here in the United States. You make a reference to the preamble of the industrial workers of the world, that organizing goes well beyond bargaining for wages, benefits, and working conditions. And I'm going to quote you now from your book that, quote, "We are and always have been organizing to transform society and to become more fully free, more fully realized, more fully human." So in this moment, how do you think about the role of unions in rectifying or mitigating this crisis in democracy?
I think that growing workplace democracy at your job also translates to having a greater understanding for and practice of democracy outside of your workplace. I think it's incredibly critical that unions understand the principles of solidarity and don't compromise with authoritarianism. A lot of reactionaries will try to have, this faux populist appeal where if you're certain kinds of the working class, if you're a white cis male, documented, et cetera, kind of worker in certain approved industries, and your concept of organizing is very limited to workplace conditions and wages, then maybe you get some kind of support. But if you're anything that's not that, if you're in other industries, if you're an immigrant, if you're not a cis white dude, then good luck to you. You don't fit into that authoritarian model of the working class. And I think as we're seeing unions like the UAW pivot from saying Trump is a scab during the election to now saying, oh, we're willing to work with Trump on tariffs, those are dangerous compromises. Unions have to hold the line and say, we are fighting for democracy. We're fighting for a world where everybody is going to be free. And, fundamentally, an injury to one is an injury to all. So you can't have a labor movement that makes compromises with a regime that's sending other union members to El Salvador concentration camps. So first, I think the labor movement has to be really consistent and really principled and understand solidarity. Number two, I think worker organizing is the only thing that's going to be able to save us in this moment from fascism and authoritarianism, because I think, we've seen the effectiveness of general strikes historically. I think having unions that can truly mobilize and also that give workers a place to build power outside of the state and outside of corporations is really fundamental and is, one of the most effective ways to build that kind of power independently of these hostile structures. Everyone should be organizing a union. Maybe it will take a while. Maybe not everything is going to translate into a beautiful first contract immediately. But I think no organizing effort is ever wasted. And so having that practice of democracy is incredibly fundamentally important right now, more than ever.
Right. Well said. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. So what's a good way to turn the insights that you've shared with us into action?
One of the most important ways to effectively organize a union is to keep things quiet until you're ready to go public, because workers are constantly getting fired for trying to start union efforts. And it usually follows a pattern of, somebody enthusiastically starts talking very quickly to other coworkers without having the backing of a union, without having a plan in place. And so I would say organize a union, but make sure that you have certain protections and certain backing lined up. Folks can also reach out to us at the Inside Organizer School. There's a contact on the website. It's insideorganizerschool@gmail.com. And we can help connect people with unions that can have their back. People can come to the trainings. We have them, at different places around the country. Everybody should be organizing, but also understand the best strategies to try to prevent companies from retaliating before the campaign even gets off the ground.
Yes, good advice. Thank you. Last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
So one of the projects I've been working on has been helping unions set up salting programs and helping recruit folks who are interested in joining the labor movement, become connected with ways to get involved with organizing campaigns. We've seen a huge surge of interest, and people are really looking for a way to get involved tangibly and to start putting their beliefs into action. So I think people are seeing the labor movement as one of the more hopeful places in society, and that makes me feel like this movement is going to keep growing. And I think that people are correctly seeing that mass organizing and organizing around class is the way to move people on all of these other issues and the way to join together all of these other issues. I think it's going to be a really rough time, but I think solidarity will help us get through.
Yeah, hear, hear. I hope you're right. Thank you so much for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
No, thank you.
Jaz Brisack is a union organizer and co-founder of the Inside Organizer School, as well as the author of Get on the Job and Organize, Standing Up for a Better Workplace and a Better World. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Stand in solidarity with unions and with those organizing unions. And if you're planning on organizing, building community with fellow workers, or starting a union in your workplace, keep your plans close to the vest. Get the campaign off the ground before any powers that be have a chance to stomp it out. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by Loretta Ross. She's a feminist, activist, and author of Calling In, How to Start Making Change with Those You'd Rather Cancel.
Everybody has their own opinion. And through calling in, you can use your immense curiosity to find out how they got to that opinion. What have they been through that makes them think what they think? And what have you been through that makes you think what you think? And that, to me, is the best way to invite people into conversations instead of fights.
That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. We're here to help you stay engaged. So follow Future Hindsight now, and we'll come right to you every week. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work that we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, join the Civics Club on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Future Hindsight. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack, Travis, and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,